Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our today's webinar. My name is Varun, and I'm the founder of easyQ Solutions. In our today's session, we'll be talking more about the role QMS function plays within an organization and its importance to overall regulatory approvals. But before we begin, I would like to welcome our guest for today, Karan Jhaveri. Karan is currently working as Quality System Director at Philips and has more than 15 years of experience in medical device industry, which includes his experience working with companies such as Philips and Medtronic. In his experience, he has also got a chance to work closely with regulatory affairs. Karan, welcome to our session, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Varun. It's a pleasure, and yeah, these topics are very close to what I do on a day-to-day basis. It'll be a good discussion. So let's begin.
Perfect. Thanks, Karan. So, Karan, usually, in our webinars, what we want to do for our listeners is, try to keep it as close as possible from the practical aspect, right? So we don't go too much into the nitty-gritties and the jargons, right? We try to make it, more practical and help the listeners understand, the different aspects of QMS and regulatory, right? So today's topic, as I said, is where we want to discuss more about the role QMS plays, right, from a regulatory perspective, right? Many a times it is seen as two different departments, right? Especially in MNCs, where you have worked more closely. You have a separate department for regulatory for QMS, right? And it is usually seen as an isolated department, right? But when you talk about getting your regulatory approvals, right, how does QMS play a role? I think that's what we want to learn from you today, right, with whatever you have to share with us, right? With that note, Karan, with your permission, can we begin?
Yes.
Okay. So, Karan, the more often, right, I keep having this discussion with people I meet and in my own career, right? So the very basic question that I want to start with, right, is what is QMS according to you, right? We all know the theoretical definition about processes and input and outputs and all of that, right? But beyond that, what is QMS for you?
Yeah. So from a practical perspective, right? QMS, is when you say it's a collection of processes, right? And what I mean by that is there's different facets for medical device product development, from building the product, manufacturing it, distributing it, post market feedback, and then always making sure that you're in the mode of continuous improvement based on the feedback that you get, right? For all of these activities, there needs to be one documented way of doing it, because in the medical device industry, unless you've documented these things, it doesn't happen, right? So the QMS allows you to set a framework to get all of these different processes for the areas that I mentioned, to build that, document that, train people to that, so you perform activities based on that in a consistent way. The people understand it, and it's easy to then use that information for the clearances of your products, to make sure that you, based on the data you get, you improve your products, and so on and so forth. So that's your foundation, as well as the framework on which your products are based on.
So, Karan, very interesting, right? So, one of the key aspect of QMS you mentioned is standardization, right? You want to ensure there is some level of standardization within the organization to have consistency in your output, right? Um, we are in today's world, right? You see a lot of companies, a lot of startups coming up, right, with unique, different innovations that they are trying to bring into the market, right? Uh, what are your thoughts? Like, you know let's say there is a startup which has 5 or 10 employees, and then there is company like Medtronic or Philips which has thousands of employees, right? When you talk about standardization, when you talk about QMS, right, does it mean the QMS that you have for Philips or a Medtronic is going to be the same for a startup with 5 or 10 employees? How does it differ? What should you keep in mind?
Yeah, so the way to look at it is your QMS should be working for your organization from a site perspective, from a product perspective, from an understanding perspective, and what you're trying to do, right? The overarching process by which you would measure a QMS was how simple it is for your users to understand it, and to comply to the regulations and to make sure you have effective outcomes, right? Some product portfolios in these companies that you mentioned are very different or could be very different compared to the products that these startups may be getting into, right? So there are some things which could be standard, like you have your management reviews, your quality manuals, things like that. The way you do those could be probably the same way of doing those things, but there are other activities which, like product development processes, um, could should be dependent on what you're trying to achieve from the company perspective, how quickly you can execute to that, and simplify it to your users, uh, so that they can execute to it. So you can't have one size fits all based on the
Hmm.
size of the organization. You can leverage best practices from these companies that have been there, but also you have to make sure that the QMS should be working for your organization. If it's a small organization, then you need to execute quickly, and you'll have people that will be wearing multiple hats, usually during these startup companies. So they need to be able to move from one thing to other with lightning speed, as well as making sure that you're compliant to your regulations.
Well said. Yeah, and that's so often that I have seen organizations with very limited number of people and wearing multiple hats and trying to be more efficient over there, right? Karan, your thoughts on also, just one last question on the same question. When you talk so we understand QMS being different or tailored to looking at the size of the organization. What about the products that the organization may come up with? Does your QMS even have an impact on that? Does QMS even have an impact based on a company working with, let's say, software as a medical device versus someone working on active device versus someone working on in vitro diagnostic device?
Yeah, absolutely, right. Because the regulations would be different for different types of devices in terms of certifying those products and what they need to meet from the standard perspective, right? What may work from a software as a medical device product would be very different compared to like an X-ray imaging system, which has a combination of software and hardware, and an interaction of that perspective, right? Lots of electronics involved in those types of equipments as well. So your fundamental processes from the QMS standpoint, you all have to meet the same regulations, but the nuances within those processes would be different based on the products. And that's why it gets interesting when it gets to a startup versus an organization which has a portfolio of diverse products, right? Because if you have a startup and you're making one type of products, it's easier for you to manage your QMS and streamline it to the effect where it's efficient. But that harmonization piece, when it comes to an organization which has different flavors of products, both hardware, software, combination, in vitro, simplification and harmonization becomes challenging, because then you have to make sure that you cater to every single detail, which sometimes defeats the purpose of oversimplifying and harmonizing, which doesn't meet that requirements for each type of product. So there's a fine balance on what you can simplify and not simplify, and harmonize and not harmonize. But getting back to, does the product play a part? Absolutely, it does.
One my this is my personal question, right? My personal experience rather, right, more than question is, many a times when I'm interacting with industry experts, consultants, right, and there is a general mindset which I have faced, where they try to control or they try to put everything under process, right? And what
Mm.
happens is eventually, the list of documents, processes, work instruction forms, whatever word you may want to use under QMS regime, right, uh, keeps on building, like becoming larger and larger, right? uh, what's your thoughts on such an approach?
Yeah, and that is true to a certain case. So from a requirements perspective, when you want to meet the regulations, there has to be certain processes and which have to be documented, and you need to have processes for those. The regulations like the 21 CFR 820 is not going to tell you what you need to have in your processes. They'll essentially tell you need to have this documented, and the organization is free to create the process they feel meets the requirements. So the onus is on the organization, right? On how detailed and how descriptive and how complicated or how simple you want to have your process. But you cannot get away with not having processes. Okay.
Hmm.
That being said, the processes should be simple enough for people to execute. Not
Hmm.
everything needs to be described in a way where document it and report it out and have forms and templates for each and every step of the things, right? Um, so that's the balance that we have to play. You have to have processes for sure, but covering the requirements, keeping them high level to meet the regulations, and then give the users the ability to document it in a structured way is how you would frame a QMS, which is simple and nimble enough to execute, right? If I were to ask a product development engineer to use a design controls process which has 200 or templates that they have to fill out, he say, I'm here to design products and develop products. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty and document every single thing that I do. And which is, you take that with a grain of salt, because when the regulators come in, if your QMS is that complicated and you require them to document and you don't have those documentations, then you're going to be
Exactly.
in trouble when they come in,
True.
right?
True. True.
But at the same time, if your processes are simple enough where you document what's required per the regulations, then you meet the regulations at the same time you meet all the compliance requirements as well.
I thought the response to your hypothetical question to the developer would have been, "Man, do you want me to resign?" But how often
It,
have we seen that, right? How often have we
yeah,
seen, the burden of documentation is always something that, mostly the developers would want to stay away, and for the right reason that you mentioned. I think the focus
yeah,
for the developers should be on developing the product. That said, let's move towards our next question. That I want to move towards more on the regulatory side. So, Karan, many a times, right, in organization, again, especially in organization, big organizations, where you have experience working, right, primarily, they typically have QMS and regulatory as two different functions, right? And I have seen organizations where they are mostly combined as a single unit, or and then again I have seen where they're two different organizations. What are your thoughts on that, right? What do you think? Should it be, what is the pro and con in a way to having them isolated or to having them separated out?
yeah. So there's pros and cons, like you said, for both. So I'll start with the differences in setup from a regulatory and the QMS landscape, right? The things and the skill sets are different. The requirements are different. So from my experience, the regulatory function is involved in getting your products cleared by the way of either having technical files put in place, your 510Ks put in place, all of those types of things, and then working with the agencies and notified bodies to clear your products through technical documentation reviews and so on and so forth, right? That's their expertise. The QMS, like I mentioned earlier, is the framework on which you get to the documentation and get to having a product in place, right? You just can't say, I have a product now, go clear this. There's steps that you have to take from designing to developing and testing, all of those activities once you have a product in place. So the skill sets, the requirements, the job responsibilities are slightly different. At the same time, those are two peas in the pod, right? Those two functions. One can't work without the other. You can't have products cleared without having a QMS in place. And if you just have QMS in place and you have your perfect QMS with all of the bells and whistles from a process perspective, and at the end, if you don't have a product and that can be cleared, then there is no value in that too, right? So those functions work together most of the times, and when organizations can have, depending on the size, different groups managing different activities, it works from that standpoint. In smaller companies, and I've had experience before I started in Medtronic and in Philips, I worked at another smaller contract manufacturing company where I used to play the function of both QA and RA in a single function. So it all depends on the organization, the setup, what type of products you have, and you can have it in a single function. You can also have it as a different function. It works together. The main thing is that both functions rely on each other very heavily.
Mhm.
Uh,
Makes sense. Um, do you think having it two different or under one roof, is there any question related to efficiency? Do you think having it as two different functions makes your overall, compliances or time to compliance, right, less efficient?
Not necessarily. It wouldn't make it less efficient. Um, you have to ensure that the communication is solid, robust, not only between QA and RA teams, but also between all of the functions upfront, right? You can't
Hmm.
have product development started in an isolation where your R&D team start working on a product where regulatory is not involved and QMS is not involved uh, from the beginning. If that is the case, then we will see issues because sometimes the information that needs to be discussed upfront from a strategy development on a regulatory plan, the QMS plan, all of those activities, if that's not accounted for early on in your project, you will you will see that the time to build the product to clear the product is going to significantly increase. So the efficiencies don't it's not inefficient unless there is lack of communication, right? If the teams are brought on early on and are working together with a single goal of new product development or design changes or whatever you have, um, it will most often than not work
Got it.
in a positive way.
Let's talk about regulatory approvals, right? So let's take
Mhm.
an example of, let's say, 510K approval, or if when you talk about the CE
Mhm.
marking, the EU MDR or IVDR, right? Um,
Mhm.
let's talk about 510K, right? So the whole process of 510K approval is typically what falls under the bucket of the regulatory side of things, right?
Mhm.
Simple question: where is QMS coming to the picture? How does QMS come into the picture?
Yeah, so from a 510K perspective, one that we need to establish is the process for how you're going to create a 510K. What are your predicate devices? What type of information you require in the 510K? So you, from the QMS perspective, you need to have the process in place uh, to essentially make sure that every time you do a 510K, you have all of the requirements covered. So that's the QMS foundation piece, right? For a specific 510K development, there are other activities specifically within the 510K that are required. So regulatory has to then work with all of the different functions. Um, Product development, QMS, and clinical, all of those things and functions to make sure they have a robust 510K. The QMS is important because in order to get the information and the output in a streamlined way and concise enough that you want to put in the report, those types of, like I mentioned earlier, is the processes are very important, which is going to give you that output. So while the QMS team may not be involved in authoring the 510K, without the framework that you have in place, getting the information that you need to develop a 510K is going to be very difficult.
What I understand from what you just shared, right, Karan, and very important thing that you shared is what I understand from your thoughts is basically you're trying to convey that, and then correct me if I'm wrong, right? Try to convey that the byproduct of QMS is where regulatory approvals kind of come into the picture, right? Because when you have your processes of design and development, or when you have your processes of, let's say, developing a CE, or even how do you go about doing a 510K, right? When you have these processes defined, the output of that process is what will eventually help you to get your approvals. Is that thought process correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's right, and it's that, and also the product itself, right? You need to have a strong product, a robust enough product with all of the claims and all of the benefits along with that. But from the QMS perspective, absolutely, a structured way of defining the processes. The output of that is what you're going to use and submit to the regulatory agencies, which they would then review and clear the products.
Let me ask the same question, but maybe slightly in a different way. Okay, and then there
Yeah,
is a difference in both the question, right? So I asked you the question on how QMS is playing a role for your 510(k) approvals and regulatory
mm,
clearances, right? Let's take an example of, let's say, something like a customer complaint process or a feedback process, right?
yeah,
Which is mostly integral to the whole QMS framework that you're talking about, right? Now my question is, how does or what role is, again, these specific processes, right? Like feedback process, right, is playing when you talk about compliance, like when you talk about regulatory compliances, right?
yeah.
Where does your feedback process come into the picture, just as an example?
Yeah. So again, when you have a product that's in the market, right, and you want to make an improvement to that product, right? So the feedback is very important. When from a post market perspective, you would review what's going on with similar devices in the market. You get that feedback, you get customer complaints that you act upon. You also look at recalls that have happened, so on and so forth, and what issues that you've seen in the market with your existing products, with your competitors' products, and what new innovations are required, right? So from that perspective, gathering that data is one of the key elements in continuous improvement of your existing products, so you can fix things that you're seeing from a complaints perspective. But also when you want to have another product uh, to replace your existing product, or put features in it, and any other modifications that you have, that data is very helpful to be used in your inputs from your design perspective. As in, when you design your new product, you would look at all of those data, so that you either mitigate those, you improve upon those, and build a product which would address those issues, right? So from that standpoint, continuous monitoring of your product portfolio, existing product portfolio, is key. It's required by your regulations as well to address customer complaints in a timely manner, as well as making sure that any claims that you make for your products are substantiated. You've got hard evidence behind it, and things like that when you go and build a product and then try to clear that product.
Okay. um Again, with my own experience, right? Many a times I see, right, in organization, especially when you talk about the development side of the world, right, the design, R&D development folks, right, they are always repulsive to the whole QMS function, or people who are part of the QMS function, right? um, d- what are your thoughts on the statement, right, that QMS plays a role in slowing down things, right?
Hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's there are situations where you hear these types of statements, but as long as there is good partnership, and I mentioned upfront, is we need to all be on the same team early on, and be together when you're starting to develop a project. So quality systems, quality engineering, they all need to be part of the core team when you have a new product development initiative, right? What that means is some of the R&D engineers, some of other functions are not day to day working towards or have an idea of the overarching requirements of your QMS, right? And they are very good at what they do. They are very good at building products, developing products, but they may sometimes oversee requirements in another area of the QMS or another area, which they may or may not know, right? So having these teams upfront, is going to mitigate that because one, they would be aware of what all is required and what their effects would be. Two is if they don't include these themes up front, that's when you see those challenges because they would come out with a certain product and a certain requirements, and then the QMS team or the product quality team would then review that and say, we've not met this requirement from the QMS perspective or the regulations perspective. And so either we need to go back and do this work again or retest it or you know do something else. That would then slow down the process at that point and a breakdown of okay, now they're asking us to do these things. That's the typical jargon that you would hear is we've done everything but the quality team is asking us now go back and do these things,
Yeah.
right? And that happens because they may have either overlooked it. It's not, nobody wants to slow down the process intentionally, but you also have to make sure that if things don't get developed in a way and you find these issues in the once you release the product for whatever reason and it impacts safety and efficacy or whatever of a patient, right? It's much harder to solve these issues once the product is in the field versus when you catch that in the development process and you fix it before you release the product, because then once the product is in the field you have to deal with recalls, you have to deal with all of the you know uh, stigma that would probably come with on the brand of your product as well if you were to then recall a product to fix a safety issue, or you have to recall a product and that somebody died while using the products or something adverse that happens, right? There's a lot of things that happen in the field which impact your organization negatively, and so nobody wants to do it intentionally. But the key message that I would say is to bring these teams on board early on and have them be part of your core team. That way you look at those things together and make sure that you release a product which is compliant to the regulations and can be cleared quickly.
On the same note, right, Karan, so you know eh, this is probably applicable for every organization, right, that is going to the market, and time to be in the market, right, is very important, right, because post that companies are going to make revenues and things like that, right? But it becomes even more important for a small startup to to be more to save as much as time possible and try to put their product in the market, because they're everything after that is what is going to
Yeah.
define the future of a startup, right? So probably true for everyone, but more important for a startup, right? So keeping, let's say, a startup in mind, right, how and the same topic, right, how can what is your advice for them to be able to be more efficient, right? What are one or two things that a startup can keep in mind to ensure that their QMS is compliant, at the same time they be efficient, right? How can they do that?
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind is to not strive for perfection from the beginning, right? As a startup, depending on what phase you are in as a startup, right? You have a great idea and you have to have a QMS framework in a place that is meeting your requirements in a simplistic way, right? You also have to keep in mind if you're one is you're making a medical device, which is very different than making, furniture which is going to be used, right? So the quality of your medical device impact lives of patients, users, things like that. And you're dealing with somebody's family and friends, your own family could be using the products, right? So you just can't be in the race to put your product out there with having compromises in any of the safety aspects of your product. Okay, that's a given. But there's ways to have your QMS simple enough with not having overly prescriptive requirements, uh, that is a best practice or good to have, right? Obviously, you have to have requirements in place to meet the regulations, and you need to keep them. As long as you do that with speed and making sure you have the right people included in your projects upfront, you would
Mm.
see that the time to get to market is going to greatly reduce versus if you try to make a perfect product with perfect documentation, which is like watertight, and spend more time working on cosmetics of documentations rather than what is it going to take to clear the product. Once you have that, it's good enough, and you go. You always have to, on the other hand, you also have to be continuously open for feedback and continuously improve based on your reviews from your regulators. As long as you don't compromise on product safety and you meet the requirements, you should be in a good state.
Well said. Yeah, how often I've seen again, you know, people spending so much of time on trying to fix, you know, the cosmetic part, as you said, right? Although
Yeah.
it might be important, the GDP elements and all, but they get stuck over there, right? And then that itself becomes a big issue for them to get their delays, right? Um, uh, 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 well said. Thanks for that. Um, Karan, again, going back to what we were discussing from the regulatory side, right? Um, Another question that I had for you was, you mentioned about how QMS is helping regulatory, or where it plays a role, and you gave a nice answer where you mentioned the output of QMS basically helps in enabling the regulations, right, or meeting the regulations, right?
Yeah.
um, Let me do a role reversal, right? How is regulatory playing a role in QMS, right, within your framework that you mentioned about QMS creating, right?
Mm.
How is regulatory fitting in? Where can you give me some examples of how regulatory fits in?
Yeah. So again, so from a process perspective, right, is your QMS is a framework, right? Regulatory processes for creating 510Ks, distributing product like registrations. There's global registrations all over the globe, which some countries may have their unique requirements. Some countries may rely on the existing approvals of your ISO and MDSAP and CE marking, things like that. Now, a lot of countries are coming with their own specific requirements. You look at China, which have the NMPA requirements. I know India is coming with their local requirements, right? The QMS, obviously, we want to make it as simple as possible to meet the requirements, which is global requirements for the most part. When there is unique requirements, that country specific requirements that come in, that's where the regulatory team is a great partner for QMS. One is to evaluate that specific regulation that is country specific, and then working with the QMS team to make sure that any gaps that we have in our existing processes based on the country specific requirements are addressed in a timely way, and so that we don't have issues getting products out in these markets. So I would say that would be a key role from a gap regulatory assessment. Another way where it works is often in organizations there is a process where the regulatory team is involved in what we call as new and changing requirements review, right? Global requirements change periodically, some more than others. So there's a framework that needs to be in place where the regulatory team, who are much more closer to the regulations, review those requirements and initially make an impact whether it impacts our product portfolio or not. If it doesn't impact our product portfolio, maybe we don't really need to do anything to the QMS. If it does, then we need to work with appropriate stakeholders depending on what is changing in those regulations to address and update the QMS in a timely way so we meet those requirements. I think that is one of the most critical pieces. Sometimes it's overlooked because if we don't have that program in place, you may or may not know that something is specifically changing in a specific requirement, and it's too late once you find out, and then you have issues downstream. So I think that would be a good way for regulatory to partner with the QMS team to make sure we keep our documents updated.
Perfect. You have Karan on one side ISO 13485, right, which is global
Yep.
QMS standard for medical devices. Then you have your 21 CFR Part 820. You also have your EU MDR, which is more of a towards regulation, but it also has its requirements from a QMS and process perspective, right? When you have, and then you have your MD SAPs and for your
Yeah.
from your Health Canada SORs, and then other regulatory which might also be feeding into your QMS, right? But let's say primarily let's take 13485 CFR Part 820, two QMS, one QMS standard, other QMS regulations, right? Uh, when you're looking at these, right, my first question is there a choice or is there a preference to look at one over the other? And second is, if both are to be looked into, right, again, simple steps to be more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, it it depends on where you want to market your products. One, right, is not only just the 13485 and 820 that's required for general certification for your QMS, but you also look into if your market is not in Europe, for example, and that's a very rare case when you would not have your products marketed in Europe, you may or may not want to have those requirements. If you're not going to sell in China, you don't need to worry about your local NMPA requirements. From a QMS perspective, most often than not, 13485 is recognized worldwide. And even for registrations, sometimes 13485 certificate is required, right? And with the 820, 21 CFR 820, which is your US side of things, if your market is not the US, maybe you can argue, but what is happening now is as you may be aware, that the US FDA is coming out with what is called as a QMSR, which is an update in their 21 CFR 820, and they are basing that on 13485.
Mhm.
Right, so there are certain sections which are going to get updated in the regulations in the CFR based on 13485, right? So the world is coming more and more closer to having a unified way of looking at the
Yep.
regulation. So it is going to be very hard to just exclude one over the other.
Mhm.
But at the same time, that's been recognized in the industry as well. So a lot of regulations are being streamlined, from that perspective as well. So yeah, that's not a good answer of just overlooking one completely, unless it's a country that you're not going to sell in, which is has its own country specific requirement. But in order to have efficiencies, you look at 13485 and 820 now, and starting in 2026 when they're going to be effective, uh, those are already going to be streamlined to a way where it's going to be consistent.
Current trick question, man. 13485 CFR. Pick one.
I can't.
if
I
I had to
can't.
put if I had to put a gun on your head and ask you to pick one to implement, which one would you choose?
You have to implement. Like I said, you have to implement both. There's both in a way. You can't. Maybe you implement one first versus the other. But the requirements, if you look at 13485, you look at the requirements in 820. If you implement 13485, you may cover most of the 21 CFR 820 requirements, but 820 also has specific requirements, not only 820, but the US FDA requirements when it comes to corrections and removals, the recalls, the reportability, the adverse events, all sorts of other regulations. It's going to be very difficult for you to not focus on those and be able to sell your products in the US, right?
Yeah.
So it's just the timing of which ones you would implement first. I know which one's easier to implement, but you would not get away with not having those requirements embedded.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think that key takeaway from here is to ensure that you understand your market where you intend to sell your product, right? Where you want to market your product, right? and
Yeah.
then based on that, you will have to define your QMS. Well said. Thank you so much. So Karan, in your experience, right, if you have to share some do's and don'ts, or if you have to share some key takeaways for some of the young startups that are coming up, right, or even people who intend to go into QMS or have just started their journey in the QMS, right,
Mhm.
what would those be?
Yeah, I mean, I would say embrace the QMS. It's not something that you have to, you're being forced to do it. Sometimes people who don't have a background in the QMS space or the regulation space feel like a burden of having so much documentation that you have to do. Right? But embrace that you need to have that. It's going to help you save a lot of issues downstream if you have simple, effective processes developed that meet the requirements. You don't want to get into the crosshairs of the regulators when they come in and not clear your product. Ultimately, you want to clear your product. That is the first step in making revenue, right? As you said. But again, going back to what we are doing is we are making medical devices which are going to be used by people that can change their life, right? And so if we don't design the products appropriately upfront, if we have issues of, when we release the product and are not able to then sell the product, put them on hold or recall the products, it's going to create revenue impacts, brand impacts, and things that are going to not be looked at favorably, right? So embrace the QMS, embrace the different regulations. Don't overcomplicate it. You have to try and keep it as simple as it needs to be without overburdening your departments. And as long as you meet the requirements with a simple enough process in place to meet those, that would be my only feedback when it comes to new startups that are coming out. Um, to develop their own QMSs and make sure the products are cleared, right? Is to keep it simple.
Perfect. Hey Karan, it was pleasure having you over here, man. I mean, I learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for sharing your time. We are pretty much on the close of today's session, but any last thoughts?
No, I think this was good. Hopefully, it was helpful for everybody listening in. And yeah, I'm open to answer. Be in touch on LinkedIn and so on and so forth. If there's anything else I can help out with, I'm always there. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Varun, to come in and share my thoughts. And yeah, this was a good experience.
It's a pleasure, man. Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, please reach out to Karan if you guys have any question. Please reach out to to easyQ Solutions, to me if you guys have any questions. If you have any suggestions, as if there are any topics that you may want to want us to consider and have it to be considered in our next webinar. I think few takeaways in our today's session. Our today's session was primarily focused on helping you guys understand how um, you know QMS and regulatory work together, right? For me, it was always that they are two sides to the same coin, right? I think one of the key takeaway is the QMS should always be the outcome of of your QMS should be something that enables market approvals, right? And it should not be seen as, although they might be two different functions, but something that has been tightly coupled in, right? And I think second thing that Karan rightly mentioned is you want to keep your processes simple, don't overcomplicate matter, right? If I can add something to what Karan shared is try to start as early as possible, right? And have a vision in which in which direction you are going or heading to, right? With this, we come to an end to our today's session. Again, thank you so much, Karan, for being part of this session. It was lovely having you over here, and all our listeners, thank you so much for to for turning up and listening in. As I said, please feel free to reach out to us, and would love to hear back from you guys. Until then, stay tuned. We will come up with our next webinar. We shortly we'll plan that, and as promised, we'll come and talk to you guys again. Uh, but until then, thank you so much. Thanks, Karen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks all. Bye bye.